Welcome to In Search of Heaven's Gate, an exploration of the history, beliefs, and practices of the Heaven's Gate movement. This is Episode 4, Mind, Body, and Soul. In 1986, 11 years after their group was founded, some followers of Heaven's Gate published a book entitled The Transfiguration Diet. As the name might suggest, the bulk of this book is devoted to their dietary regimens, what they ate, what they refrained from eating, and why. But there is another reason I'm bringing up this book today, and it has to do with the question we left off with at the end of the last episode. Namely, this question of why the followers of Heaven's Gate so frequently exchange the terms mind and soul when talking about what happens after death, according to their belief system. Today, we're going to examine a short section of the Transfiguration Diet, in which the authors attempt to clarify just what exactly it is that they thought survives after bodily death, what they refer to as the mind or the soul, and why they thought that both of these terms were equally effective at describing their conception of the afterlife. As I mentioned last time, this group's conception of the afterlife can seem a bit unclear and even contradictory at times. But perhaps if we can first make sense of what they meant by the mind or soul, we'll arrive at a more coherent picture of their beliefs about what happens after death. In the previous episode, we were left with more questions than we began with. Now it's time we got some answers. First, I want to briefly introduce the text we're going to be reading from today, a book called The Transfiguration Diet. The Transfiguration Diet is one of the more obscure works within the Heaven's Gate canon. It's not available on the group's website, nor is it an easy book to find for purchase since it went out of print. In fact, even if by some small chance you happen to come across this book, like at a thrift shop or a yard sale, it's very unlikely that you would even know it had anything to do with a UFO cult, let alone Heaven's Gate specifically. That's because the Transfiguration Diet, when it was first published, was attributed not to some obscure religious movement, but rather to a self-proclaimed research group known as Dr. Little Green Incorporated's think tank. According to the Transfiguration Diet, Dr. Little Green Incorporated's think tank had spent the last decade experimenting with a variety of health programs, which they had now collected in order to share their findings with others. One of the first things you see when you open this book is a series of pages that appear to contain nothing but rave reviews from people who claim to have found success after implementing the health program recommended by this mysterious team of self-described nutrition experts. In reality, however, this think tank was really none other than the members of the group that we now refer to as Heaven's Gate. Dr. Little Green did not exist. There was no think tank, and the reviews that appear at the beginning of the book were written by the authors themselves, using made-up names in place of their own. Which is not to say that all of the reviews were necessarily completely fabricated. I mean, the Transfiguration Diet at one point was the sum of a variety of health regimens that were used by the followers of Heaven's Gate, so it's possible that some of these so-called reviews were genuinely the experiences of the authors. Of course, it is important to keep in mind that their expertise, as they call it, in the area of nutrition is ultimately confined to their own experience with the techniques that they themselves developed. There's even a disclaimer on the opening page that cautions readers against applying anything the authors recommend without consulting with a qualified medical professional. One reason that the members of Heaven's Gate who authored this book may have wanted to remain anonymous was that they hoped their new diet would join the ranks of many other health trends that were popular in the 1980s. They probably thought that the success of their work would be hindered if they associated their new diet with, well, a religion that preached about space aliens and whose leader believed he was the second coming of Christ. That's why they tried to give it a sense of legitimacy by attributing the book to a research team. But even with this in mind, the group still just couldn't resist leaving little clues about their true identity scattered throughout this work. Many of the illustrations that accompany the book, which were drawn by former Heaven's Gate member Dick Jocelyn, feature a character whose physiology is curiously similar to what many of us might think of when we imagine space aliens. There's all these drawings of a tall, slender figure with a very large head floating around in some sort of craft, in which he presumably traipses through the stars while making himself smoothies and refraining from unhealthy snacks. And then there's Dr. Littlegreen himself, almost certainly a nod to Marshall Applewhite, but also a thinly veiled reference to the so-called Little Green Men, i.e. extraterrestrials. I mean, they had to know that anyone who picked this book up when it first came out would be puzzled by these illustrations and this Dr. Littlegreen character, but I suspect that this was done more for them than for us. I imagine they got a big kick out of hiding all these little Easter eggs in their book. In the end, though, I suppose it really didn't make a difference whether they acknowledged who they really were or not, since the book eventually went out of print anyway, and the dietary trends that they hoped would revolutionize the way Americans ate never really went beyond the group's own kitchen. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Transfiguration Diet is a pretty difficult book to track down today. It's an obscure text even amongst other Heaven's Gate researchers. So you might be wondering, how did I even hear of this book, and how did I manage to get a copy of it? But that's a story I'll have to save for another time. For now, let's dive into it and see what we can learn about how Heaven's Gate believers understand the relationship between mind, body, and soul. Early on in the Transfiguration Diet, before there's any concrete details given about which foods to eat and which to avoid, the authors attempt to clarify what we could call their philosophy of health, what they thought a healthy life consisted of, and how they arrived at these views. In a chapter called The Three Eyes, Who's Talking?, they end up covering a range of complex, interrelated topics, including their conception of the self, their views on psychology, personality theories, and, as indicated earlier, their understanding of the mind or soul. The following is taken from page 16 of the Transfiguration Diet. Quote, "Our team's vernacular uses the word mind in the same context as religious terminology does in reference to the spirit or soul. The clarification of this usage is in no way intended to propose or endorse any particular religion, though the terminology could seem to suggest as much. We're merely trying to clarify the understanding of our three-voice concept, mind, heritage, environment. Whether this terminology is suitable in the eyes of some is really of no concern to us. The fact is that using it to implement the concept of genetic reprogramming has proven unquestionably to work to a T. The technique is so successful and yields such remarkable consistency in results that our team is currently involved in exploring this topic in depth." End quote. Even in this brief snippet of text, there's already a lot to unpack. You'll notice there are a number of new concepts being introduced, concepts that all appear to be related in some way, although it's not immediately clear what they all mean. What is the three-voice concept? What do Heaven's Gate believers mean by genetic reprogramming? What do they mean by mind, heritage, and environment? And how does any of this relate to their conception of the soul? These are things we'll want to explore in more detail, but let's start by looking at the explanation they give for why they substitute the words mind and soul so often. Well, they tell us two things. First, that what they mean by the mind is comparable to what some religions mean by the soul. In other words, the reason they use both terms is because, from their perspective, both terms refer to essentially the same thing, or at least something similar. They use both terms because it makes sense to do so. But then they go on to assert that their real concern is one of practicality. And they're very explicit on this point, that from their perspective, what matters is not whether it makes sense, but whether it works. Within a single paragraph, the authors appear to have contradicted themselves. Are they trying to say that this practice of term substitution works for them in spite of whether or not it makes sense? Or are they trying to say that the reason it makes sense is because it works? After thinking about this for a long time, I've come to believe that the answer lies somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, it does seem as though their motivation is something practical. This would be perfectly in line with what we know about the Heaven's Gate movement and the emphasis that they placed on presenting their ideas in a way that was accessible to others. Recognizing that their own unusual terminology could alienate potential recruits, the members of Heaven's Gate would often compromise when dealing with the public. They would use their own unique terminology alongside terms that they thought would be more familiar to outsiders. For any given concept in their own belief system, they might employ a multitude of terms or phrases. We see this with the way they talk about the afterlife all the time. They use the terms kingdom of God or level above human interchangeably. So perhaps that's why they use the terms mind and soul interchangeably. Perhaps they wanted to appeal to as broad an audience as possible. This interpretation falls apart very quickly, though, by the end of the paragraph that I just read. Quote, whether this terminology is suitable in the eyes of some is really of no concern to us. End quote. So, what's actually going on here? Well, this is part of the problem with assuming that there is, in fact, a practical explanation for every belief and custom we observe within the Heaven's Gate religion, or for that matter, any religion. Because the truth is, religious practices are not always practical. Not everything a religious believer says and does within the context of their belief system can always be easily explained in purely rational, logical terms. Which is not to say that we must first accept a belief system in order to understand it. That would be going to the other extreme. It's just something to keep in mind as we move forward. There are certain things in Heaven's Gate that do appear to be informed by a kind of pragmatism, a concern for the practical implications of some particular way of talking or acting. But not everything is going to be as easily explained. In this case, they seem to be more concerned with how their choice of language affects their ability to change their own behavior. They don't seem to be very concerned with whether or not their choice of language makes sense to us. What matters is that it made sense to them. Whichever term they chose to use didn't really make much difference, because from their perspective, either term could capture what it was they were trying to express. They both referred to the same basic idea. Whether they chose to call it a mind or a soul, the followers of Heaven's Gate believed that there was something that persists after the body dies. I think we have our answer to that question we left off with last time. The reason they use both terms is because they believe both terms refer to the same thing. And the reason they believe both the mind and soul refer to the same thing is at least partly because in their experience, they found that using both of these terms has had some practical benefit for them, specifically insofar as it's helped them to modify their own behavior, something that was extremely important to the followers of this movement. So maybe it really isn't an either-or type of thing. Maybe the followers of Heaven's Gate came to accept certain beliefs precisely because they found that doing so had some sort of benefit to them. One of the things that makes their belief system so interesting is that it was constantly evolving, with new concepts being added while others fell away. But behind any of these developments, there was always the backdrop of the believer's own practical experiences, at least as they understood them. So we could say that their practices were informed by their beliefs, but at the same time, their beliefs were shaped by what they practiced. The relationship between the development of religious beliefs and the application of religious practices is exceedingly complex, and it's something we'll return to at a later stage in this exploration of the Heaven's Gate religion. But for now, I think we're in a good position to move on to some of the other concepts they've introduced in this chapter: genetic reprogramming and this three-voice concept, which is what we'll be looking at next time. This concludes episode 4 of In Search of Heaven's Gate. Thanks for listening.